Hello again, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. It's me again, Jaiska, and I'm going to be covering the next chapter, as promised, of Dr. Michael Parenti's book, Blackshirts and Reds. I have my physical copy with me right here. If you haven't seen my first video, which covers Chapter 1 and the preface of the book, not in that order, go check that out first and then return here. We'll get right into it with Chapter 2 being called Let Us Now Praise Revolution. Most of U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century has aimed to suppress revolutions and their governments. As far back as 1898, the U.S. killed more than 200,000 Filipino women, children, and men through a war of attrition while simultaneously suppressing the Boxer Rebellion in an invasion of China. The U.S. provoked Spain into a war in order to steal Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines, and Hawaii. They then proceeded to invade Mexico, the newborn USSR, Nicaragua, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, all soon after the Spanish War, with huge losses of human life through each and every one of those invasions. The first section of this chapter is called The Cost of Counter-Revolution. Parenti opens the section by saying that our education glosses over those aforementioned events, all of those invasions and wars, and on the off chance that they are mentioned, we justify them. We use reasons like the protection of U.S. interests, the thwarting of aggression, and the defense of national security. Later in this video, we'll be getting into why none of these justifications stand to scrutiny. But for now, we will talk about how the American public is told that foreigners need our guidance to be civilized, to be democratic, peaceful, and prosperous nations. So we might just need to mow down, so to speak, certain chunks of their more resistant civilians and military in order to bless them with those virtues, the democracy and the peace and prosperity. As the U.S., as the world police, we have to uplift those lesser people, the savages, somehow, right? But the existence of communist superpowers, such as the former USSR or contemporary China, further complicate the matter, because we are told that communists are evil and power-hungry, and this causes the U.S. To attempt to amputate continents in order to cure this cancer of communism. This has also been called domino theory, more specifically around the Vietnam War. The U.S. spent nearly 2 decades in Indochina waging a merciless war against revolutionaries. In these conflicts, the U.S. dropped several times more tons of explosives on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than all of the Allied nations in World War II used throughout the entire war combined. The CIA carried out 40,000 or so illegal assassinations during Vietnam, although it admits to far fewer. And the lesson that the U.S. took from the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about more in a future book, was that the Vietnamese could not be instructed by mass bombing raids and death squads. They were deemed, and I quote, unprepared for our democratic institutions. But in order to extinguish revolution and in the name of freedom, the U.S. forces and their surrogate forces, either backed or funded by the U.S., were responsible for massacring some 2 million North Koreans within only 3 years, 3 million Vietnamese, 500,000 between Laos and Cambodia, 1.5 million Angolans, 1 million in Mozambique, another million Indonesians, 700,000 plus Iraqis, 500,000 people in Afghanistan, another 200,000 in East Timor, another 100,000 in Nicaragua, another 150,000 in Guatemala, 60,000 more in El Salvador, 30,000 in Argentina, 35,000 in Taiwan through the U.S.-backed Kuomintang nationalists, 20,000 in Chile, which, as of only there, adds up to at least 10.8 million dead, and several thousands more in Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Brazil, South Africa, Western Sahara, Zaire, Turkey, and dozens more, each in what essentially adds up to a global-scale Holocaust in the name of defending the free market. This was, as of in 1997, those figures, and these totals are unfortunately no longer accurate in some of the countries I named. Of these places, most Americans can point to maybe 3 or 4 of them on a map, although I did name 24. Official sources regarding these counter-revolutions will either deny or justify the deaths of those people. Anti-communist propaganda has flooded, albeit in waves, the classrooms, our TV and radio media, and the political discourse for the past century. This is why nobody knows about the history or policies of socialism when it's implemented, about genuine attempts to reach the truth about communism, which have been snuffed by factitious fear-mongering and has led to a population simultaneously in staunch opposition to and absolutely ignorant of communism, even among its politically minded people. What you won't hear about in most talk in the West about communism is the land reform that took entire nations from luxury to exploitative landlords and gave that land back to the people. What you won't hear about is the education, the healthcare, the housing, or the jobs that offered a standard of living for people for the first time and gave masses of people a chance for the first time ever in a world that would rather have them suppressed by colonial or imperial force. Never in all of history has the quality of life improved for so many so quickly, but they won't tell you that. Popular revolutions in several nations throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America avoided picking sides in the Cold War, but they still found themselves target of counter-revolutionary intervention by the West, and we're forced to ask why that is. Perhaps the truth about that can be found in the fact that the Cold War wasn't really an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism necessarily. Rather, that any movement looking to empower the many over the few would find itself opposed to the ruling class globally. Another way to think about this is a communist or a self-proclaimed communist that takes no actions towards communism will obviously not find themselves a target. A communist that does take action in order to change the system they live in would be met by force. And because of that force, because of the idea of empowering the masses over the few, the actual act of doing so, it doesn't matter what label you slap on it because it is a threat to class privilege and to profit. The next section of this book, or the next section of the chapter is called Presumptions of Power, and it focuses on the cause and justifications of counter-revolution. Parenti begins by asserting that the ruling classes in general fear communism because it seeks to create a collectivist and socially aimed system that would logically result in economic democracy. Their global response to communism is this: counter-revolutionary intervention, which justifies itself through 4 presumptions that I'll be debunking right now, that Parenti debunks in the book. First is that U.S. leadership can determine the limit of socio-economic development for other nations. This is just patently false. There's never been an international law that gives any nation the right to choose the economic system or mode of production or mode of social development, for any other nation. However, such is the case in reality because, simply put, might makes right, and it has for most, if not all, of world history. Second, the U.S. plays a counter-revolutionary containment role to secure national interests. This is actually true, but it only is if you assume that high finance's investments are synonymous with national interests, and not the other 99.9% or so of Americans. The land, labor, resources, and markets of the Third World are kept available to that high finance through U.S. intervention. The same 99% of us end up footing the bill for that through our huge military budget, and we lose jobs to foreign labor markets. We also feel the brunt of impoverished immigrants coming here and competing with us for scarce unemployment and housing. What's more is that revolutionary governments historically, your Cubas, Vietnams, North Koreas, Libyas, countries like that, have always been eager for trade and peace with the United States. They aren't threats to the U.S. or to Americans, but rather to the interests of global capitalism. The more nations adopt socialism and use the land, the labor, the capital, and the resources towards social ends instead of profit for themselves, the closer the world is to being able to undermine capitalism abroad. The third justification, or the third presumption of power. The USA has a moral obligation to guarantee stability of nations becoming democracies that are threatened by revolution or by terrorism. Essentially, Parenti's way of addressing this is that there cannot be a moral obligation to protect democracy if the crux of your intervention is to undermine it to begin with. Most U.S. intervention intentionally serves corrupt oligarchs or militarists that either directly take over or hold a U.S.-sponsored fake election. Many are trained or taught at exclusive U.S. Universities or take CIA money alongside their militaries and police. The U.S. will even train them in torture and assassination, among other things, all in the name of democracy. And the last presumption of power Parenti addresses is that social change should be through reform, not revolution. The U.S. insists that the method of revolutions is the problem and not the objective that those revolutions seek. They insist on using investment and open markets to meet the goal, but in practice, corporate investment harms reform by preemptively manipulating the local market to suit foreign investment. The factual trend shows that the destitution in the Third World only increases as the West invests more. That was the end of that section. The next and final section for this video is called Whose Violence? It covers the dichotomy of reform and revolution, and it offers a materialist explanation as to why revolution as a phenomena occurs. Back on the topic of investment, what would the alternative be if investment only results in growing destitution? Simply put, it would be self-determination. The Third World needs first dibs on its own labor, markets, natural resources, and land to use for their own social needs. This development, however, would incite violent resistance to the point that peace seems ridiculous in contrast with the status quo in current world order. Even moderate and limited reforms in the U.S. We say were obtained peacefully, in practice entailed mass struggle and opposition, and no short supply of violence and bloodshed primarily by the police. It calls into question the idea of violent revolution because it shifts the focus on the more noticeable short-term revolutionary struggle of the masses and simultaneously overlooks the much greater, much more constant repressive violence that's aimed to maintain the status quo. This violence comes in forms like death squad assassinations, mass exterminations of entire villages, torture, suppression of dissident publications, and more that Parenti goes into. Nearly all revolutions begin peacefully, because why wouldn't they? Everybody would prefer to peacefully demonstrate as opposed to waging a war against a pitiless force that has every possible advantage over you as far as firepower, personnel, etc. is concerned. In reality, peaceful protests find themselves met with violent suppression. These people are denied peaceful protest and reform, so those that keep fighting are forced to resort to violence as well. And we call those people revolutionaries or terrorists. Those in control of the world's wealth see revolution, whether or not it's violent, as abominable nonetheless because their profits and class privilege are threatened by either. Good policies for the masses aren't as expensive nor unmanageable as we are told. With political will and popular class power, tasks for the state meant to improve the standards of living are both affordable and feasible. The example Parenti uses is Kerala. It's part of India where organized mass movements have fought hard for over 40 years as of 1997, winning important victories for the people along the way and eventually building conditions for the people that far exceeded what most of the Third World could dream of, without any type of foreign investment. Kerala has the rest of India beat on nearly every standard of living and social development possible. This was in spite of a complex agrarian-based exploitation system, partnered with the caste system, and also no special source of wealth. Poverty still exists, but low income and limited resources haven't stopped Kerala's masses from fighting for a standard of living where much of India and the Third World at large has none. Freedom from U.S. intervention, political organization, and democratic opportunity were all that Kerala needed to bring itself up. No IMF or World Bank loans and no corporate investment was necessary. Imperialist policy can disguise itself as social reform towards the Third World. U.S. foreign aid is a perfect example, as it sounds like help, obviously, with aid in its name, but in practice finds use in undermining the local markets and uprooting small farmers, concentrating resources towards amenities meant to help investors and not the people. increasing dependency and debt, and even rendering the economy defenseless against corporate penetration. In my next video, I will be finishing the chapter. Like I said, the feedback I've gotten is that the shorter videos are better for summing up the book, and it's easier to keep paying attention that way all the way through. In the second half of the chapter, we'll be talking about the facade of the free market, how revolution affects the countries, how they look before and after, and more. But for now, thank you for watching. Take care.